Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today and welcome to our session, Allied Capture and Corruption. Without any further ado, please welcome our chair, Ms. Grants Genicot, to open the session. Mrs. Grants Genicot, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to chair this session on elite capture and corruption organized by the FRED. Joining me today, we have Matt Jackson from Stanford University and Nageeb from Penn State University. And everybody is going to have in total 20 minutes for each talk. So that leaves us about 16 minutes for the presentation and a few minutes for questions just after the presentation. So without further ado, Matt, I let you go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much, Garance, for inviting us. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk about a project that's joint with John Bendor, Lukas, Bolte, Nicole, and Immorlica. And we're looking at the design of organizations and teams to try and shape the way in which people interact and minimize corruption. And some basic points on corruption, which I think are obvious to most, but important for the setup for this. Authority comes with the possibility of abuse, and most jobs have some aspects where cooperation between team members is good, but others where cooperation can be abusive or corrupt. And the question then is, how do we structure organizations to try to enhance the good cooperation and avoid the bad forms of cooperation? And in particular, corruption often involves some form of cooperation or collusion.
Matt, we don't see your slides.
You don't see my slides. Okay, let me get back to this then. Hang on. Can you see them now?
Yes.
Okay. So let me get back into this. Okay, and so here, the forms of collusion and cooperation that we're often worried about are things like the blue wall of silence, where police protect each other if they're doing illegal or harassing sorts of behaviors, coups, extortion, and bribes. And in this project, what we're going to do is we're going to build a simple game theoretic model of interacting repeated tasks and games. So the idea here is to think about games that are repeated where people are playing different forms of tasks at the same time, and the interaction between these, there are tasks where we want them to cooperate and work together, and there are ones where we don't want them to cooperate and work together. And the question is, how can you get the good forms of cooperation without the bad ones? And one question we'll ask is, when is corruption a byproduct of cooperative production? When is it that you can't avoid it? Why are some organizations and countries more corrupt than others? And in terms of organizational design, how can we best specialize things in order to eliminate corruption? Can we structure teams in the way that they're put together, how often they're put together, which tasks they're doing? Are there design aspects that can help? So we're going to be looking at, do people stay together as a unit? Are they reshuffled frequently? Which tasks are they assigned to? If we can influence payoffs, how can we influence them? And just some examples to keep in mind as we're going through this. Good forms of cooperation, patrolling, protecting if you're police. Bad forms of cooperation, harassing, extorting, taking bribes. Military fighting, patrolling, things that we would like them to do, defending the population, but atrocities, coups, pillaging, things that they could also cooperate to do that we would not like them to do. And if you put a team together and teach this team to work together and to cooperate, it's going to be sometimes hard to get them to do one thing and not the other at the same time. And that's the basic question. And this is quite widespread. I mean, you can think about it in consulting, in politics, bureaucrats. You can think about it in businesses where people could be doing the good things for you, but they could also be stealing from you. And what you want to be thinking about in terms of a model is think of a situation where, for instance, we have two police partners put together, and you'd like them to back up their partner in some sort of dangerous situation, so you'd like them to cooperate. And the reason that they would do that is that they're going to be in these situations repeatedly, and even though this is costly for them, at some point their partner is going to be backing them up, and they need to trust their partner, and so this becomes essentially a repeated prisoner's dilemma. And so the behavior we get for cooperation comes from future cooperation. Now, what happens if these things are not very frequent? So you have to do this now, but you don't necessarily have the incentive to do it because this is coming way in the future. And so you worry that you're not going to do this because it might be very rare that this occurs, and you don't necessarily trust that your partner is going to do it for you in a far future. Well, if we have different tasks, then it could be that you cooperate now in the dangerous situation because your partner is also covering for you when you take your bribe. And so there could be possibilities of other forms of cooperation. And these more frequent forms of cooperation can then make it possible to sustain cooperation in both the productive task, but also the non-productive or corrupt task. And so what we'd like to do here is to try and understand this and think about what it says about both the design question and ways in which we can avoid corruption. So let's think of at least two players playing, and we'll keep it at 2 games. So we have some teams that need to work and to do things together. And they're going to be playing, let's say, 2 games, and we'll keep it I equals 1 or 2 as the 2 games. These things come randomly at some Poisson arrival process. So some days you're doing the dangerous task, some days you're doing the task where you could be corrupt, taking bribes, and these things are coming at some random time periods. And you have a discount rate at some time. We'll just do it as exponential discounting, so you have e to the minus RT for some interest rate R. And the games are going to be ex ante symmetric. So all the players will have a chance sometimes to be the partner in danger, sometimes the partner who needs to help, etc. And there's going to be a payoff from cooperation if they're cooperating on a task. And there's also going to be an autarky. So we're just going to simplify it because this covers a whole set of games. It could be public good games and so forth. We're just going to simplify down to the essential payoffs. There's a cooperation payoff. There's an autarky if they don't cooperate at all and they just each acts in their own best interest from the short term. And then there's the gains from cooperation. And there's some deviation payoff. So if we think about this as a prisoner's dilemma, this would be the basis for cooperation. This is what you get from the Nash. So you think of, you've got a cooperation payoff. You could defect and not cooperate and get some benefit D. And then there's the Nash equilibrium. So the benefit from cooperating in the long term is just the usual difference between the cooperative payoff and the autarkic payoff, and the temptation for deviation is D. So think of that in the background, but you could think of a bunch of other games that are going to have this kind of form. And if you just played one game, you would have the benefit from that game times the expected arrival payoffs that you're going to have, depending on how frequently these are arriving at what times. And so in terms of expectation, this would just look like the benefit times the frequency this arrives at over the interest rate. Okay, so that would just be a simple calculation for the benefits of cooperating indefinitely. And the cooperation would be sustainable if your deviation payoff is less than this. Okay, so what we're going to do is now think about this in 2 game space. So there's task 1, we can cooperate on that task if the frequency of arrival is bigger than is high enough to cover the deviation compared to the benefit, right? So you've got this simple rule for when you can cooperate in a single task if it's repeated frequently enough and its payoffs are high enough. The other would be you could cooperate on task 2, and one of these might be a good task, one of them might be the corrupt task. Okay, so the idea is you could cooperate on the other one if it's frequent enough. And then if you weren't linking these 2 games together, if there wasn't any interplay between these 2 games, you could cooperate on both if the frequency of arrival of these things was both high enough compared to the deviation payoffs. Okay, so now let's put these things together and assume that this population of teams are now playing these games in concert, so they're getting a rival of both of these, then what they can do is say, okay, what's the most tempted I'll ever be to deviate? It's the max of the deviation payoffs. And the benefits that they're going to get from cooperating are the benefits from both of these over time. So we've got a higher benefit, but we then have to deal with the max of the 2 deviation payoffs if they want to sustain cooperation by using both of these games as threats of punishment in the future. So we cooperate on both tasks as long as we're cooperating, but then if somebody deviates, we stop cooperating on both. So think of Grim Trigger as a way of running this. And so now what happens is we'll end up having cooperation be possible on both games when we link them together, even though the frequency of one might be rather relatively rare, or the deviation payoff might be relatively high. There's going to be a whole set of different areas where we gain cooperation, because all we need is that the max of the deviation payoffs is better than the sum of these 2 things rather than the max of them. Okay, so the organizational questions that we're going to have then are, how frequently are people matched together? Do we randomly reassign them? Which tasks does a team do? Can we specialize them? And let me just sort of give you an idea of what the kinds of things that we can explore are with this kind of model. So imagine that there's some frequency of arrival. So we start up at this top X here, and that's the frequency of arrival of the good tasks and the bad tasks. And now what happens is we start, instead of matching teams together, we say, look, they're cooperating too much on this corrupt task, so they're too corrupt. What we'd like to do is reduce that cooperation on the corrupt task. What we could try to do is, instead of keeping these teams together, we say we're going to rematch teams every once in a while. So instead of having your same partner that you go out with all the time and you can count on being there and being corrupt with you and also protecting you, instead now we're going to assign you a new partner every day. So we start you a new partner every day, and that breaks this ability to cooperate. So it reduces the frequency with which you're going to be matched with the same partner, and that lowers the potential payoffs. If this is done very carefully, you could do it so you're matched half the time with the same partner and half the time with a different partner, and that might allow you to still cooperate on the good tasks, but not on the bad tasks. Okay, so that's one way in which you could adjust these things. The other kind of thing you might be able to do, depending on the context, so in some settings this is possible, in other settings it's not, would be to sort of divide the tasks up and say, look, these teams are going to do the dangerous patrolling, these teams are going to do the things where corruption is possible. And then you split these tasks up, and so you'll have some teams doing the more of task 2, other teams doing more of task 1. Now, in some contexts, it's not possible to do that. So in the policing context, it's not always possible to split teams up so that some of them are in danger and other ones they have the ability to do the corrupt. A lot of times these things come together, in which case you can't split these up. So we'll look at both possibilities. And then let's think about a situation where one is the good task. And so what happens is, now by putting these tasks together, we can have cooperation on one only in some region of these frequencies, or in others we have cooperation on both and cooperation on neither. And then depending on where the starting point is, so if the starting point is down here on the bottom right, what we'd like to do is reshuffle the teams so that you can get to cooperation on one only. You realize, look, they're together too frequently, they're being corrupt. By reducing that frequency with which they're together, we can eliminate the corruption and still keep their cooperation on the good task. So we have to then match them together enough to trust each other on the good task, but not on the bad task. Okay, that sort of depends on whether this is a good or a bad task. If instead one is the bad task, so this is the task that you don't want them to cooperate on, then you basically have a choice of either getting them to cooperate on both tasks or on neither. So you're stuck either saying, look, we're going to put these teams together and we realize they're going to function well as teams, but they're also going to be corrupt. And that's something we can't avoid given the restrictions that we can't adjust the frequency of the tasks. and that one is the worst task. So essentially what this shows is if temptation on the good task is high or frequency is low, then the bad task is sort of needed for cooperation, and you have a choice of either getting cooperation on both or reshuffling teams and getting cooperation on neither. So you have either you're stuck having them be corrupt sometimes and functioning well as teams, or you say, look, we're not going to assume that they're going to function well as teams. We're going to get suboptimal production, but we eliminate the corruption. If temptation on the good task is lower, then you can shuffle partly and get cooperation on good and not on the bad. And so the outcomes here sort of depend on the frequencies with which these things are arriving and so forth. And given the time, I won't go into too much detail, but here we've got cooperation on the good task, but also on the bad task is one possibility. So you're stuck with corruption. You could be ineffective on all tasks and you just shuffle your teams. Or sometimes you're lucky and you can get partial shuffling and get the good cooperation, but not the bad. The other thing is that this depends on the relative danger of the good task versus the bad task. And the more dangerous the good task is, the more incentives you need to provide people, and the more necessary the corruption becomes. And so one way to eliminate this kind of problem is to sort of make the good task less dangerous or offer change the benefits here. And we go through, given the timing, I'm not going to go into the details, but if you change the payoffs, it actually depends on whether you're changing the temptation to deviate or you're changing the overall benefits. They have different kinds of effects here. And what's really important to change is how much I value the cost in terms of the danger of going into that situation and saving my partner. That's the thing which really drives things. And you want to lower that if you really want to get the cooperation well. Okay. So, comparative statics, decreasing the temptation or the cost of the good task makes cooperation easier, and it's easier to get cooperation on the good task. And one implication of this is that in the more violent the environment, the more you're going to be faced with cooperation. So if you look at cross-sectionally, more violent situations that are more dangerous, you're going to get more corruption. And if you just try and change the benefits, you're still faced with both or neither. It's going to be hard to get cooperation on one versus the other. There's other things that we do in terms of assigning the tasks, and basically then you want to sort of break people up and shuffle the ones on the corrupt task, but keep the ones together on the more dangerous task. And just in terms of summary, I think the important thing is, from a game theoretic point of view, not thinking of one repeated game, but thinking of multiple repeated games at the same time is useful in understanding how those interact. And that leads to an interesting design questions of getting cooperation on these good tasks, but not the bad tasks. And more dangerous and costly tasks are more dependent and harder to separate out. You're sort of more forced to lead with corruption. And so you really need to decrease the danger and the cost of those. And with lower temptation, then you can begin to shuffle and help. Assigning tasks can help in some cases, but that's a longer story. So I think that's a good place to stop and see where we are in terms of timing. Garance, we can't hear you, I think, if you're talking.
You're doing really well in terms of timing. You did 16 minutes. So are there any questions regarding Matt's talk? I see comments on kindly share the presentation with us. I had a question or a comment. It relates to an old literature in development on interlinking contract, where typically you think of if you have different relationship with individuals, like those different relationships can help, like if your landlord can lend you money and so on. So it's an interesting take on this. And I was wondering if you could, what would happen if you had, here everybody is the same, so you don't have bad apples, you just have symmetric individuals. But is there a sense of, if you have some bad apple, do you want to keep on like shifting them around and so on, but then you might end up corrupting everybody or not, or do you want to isolate them and kill? Too bad you have one bad team, but so I was wondering whether you had.
Yeah, we've thought a little bit about that. We haven't worked that out in detail, but I think it's a very important question, is bringing some heterogeneity in and payoffs, since you could have some bad apples, as you say, that are more likely to be corrupt or to have different payoffs, more proclivity for corruption. And then shuffling teams can be dangerous, because now you're bringing them into each of these situations, and then their corruption can be contagious. And so in those situations, you might want to, basically try to either isolate them or effectively identify them and either fire them or penalize them. But that's a whole nother question. And I think the shuffling works well in a situation where there are symmetric, everyone's symmetric in terms of the payoffs. And the more you have people who are just completely inclined, then that means that shuffling even can be a problem, and then you're more stuck with corruption, and it's more difficult to get away from it. And so that's something we're exploring at this point, but we don't have a full answer to yet.
And Oscar Valdez had a comment about the analysis. Suppose that there's someone honest that can do, of course, the reshuffling. The state is captured, then that might be problematic.
Right. I think, this is already presuming that the designer is in some way benevolent, and who's watching the watchers always becomes an issue. And the more we have elite capture, we're stuck with corruption at a high levels and all levels. And then you need you need journalism and electorates, and it's not a simple problem. So I think that's a whole nother can of fish that we haven't opened, but certainly one that's important in practice.
But a very, very interesting talk. It feels short. I want to see the full paper. So.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much, Matt. And Nageeb, the floor is yours.
Can you see my slides and hear me? Yes, okay, great. Thanks so much for organizing and for inviting me to present here. I'm going to talk more primarily about a new project, but very briefly, I wanted to sort of outline a little bit of a research agenda that Max Mihm and Lukas, Siga, both at NYU-Abu Dhabi, and I've been pursuing. So a persistent theme we see in political economy and development is that the conflict over resources fosters distrust and suspicion. And one way we can think about how to model this distrust and suspicion is through the lens of asymmetric information and potentially moral hazard. Now, outside of political economy, we've oftentimes gotten a lot of leverage from thinking about Akerlof-style lemons problems, where the support of policy from one group can indeed be the reason why another group is going to oppose that policy. And essentially what Lukas, Max, and I have been doing is been trying to study and understand this lemons problems in a number of different instances in political economy where we think they can be pivotal. So I'll just briefly speak about, in 16 minutes, instead of talking about one paper, I'll tell you about 3 papers, but I'll very, very briefly tell you about 2 papers and then move on to the one I want to talk about. So this sort of began in a paper that Lukas, Max, and I wrote on adverse selection in distributive politics, where we thought about voters who have information about policies. Voters recognize that a trade reform or a policy reform can't benefit all of them. And then they worry that other voters who are in support of a policy, or perhaps have played a more critical role in designing that policy, may be gaining from it. And hence that may be why they are opposed to such policies. And so this is something that resonated with us when we thought about populism, when we thought about Brexit or the 2016 elections in the United States. And indeed, that's actually when we started writing this. We then proceeded in a recent paper, experimental paper with Tergiman, that's just been published in the AER in terms of trying to see the degree to which people can account for asymmetric information with both adverse or advantageous selection in the laboratory. And what I'm going to tell you about today is we thought that the first few settings sort of were getting at some of the adverse and advantageous selection, but we thought that there was something even more fundamental to how policies are often chosen or selected within a government that reflects adverse selection. And that's what we're going to talk about today. For the longest time, we didn't have a title for this project, which is why the title for my talk was a more vague adverse selection in political economy. And it's only when creating these slides that it dawned on me that the perfect title for this paper will be cherry picking. And so let me tell you about cherry picking and how cherry picking can lead to a lemons problem, if you don't mind all these fruity references. Okay, so here's cherry picking. So here's what I want you to think about. There's going to be a stylized interaction between a proposer or an agenda setter who can propose reforms. And there's going to be a veto player who can either accept or reject reforms. So you could think of the agenda setters being some legislative branch, the veto players being an executive. You could think about the agenda setter proposer being a government and the veto player being voters who are voting on it, so on and so forth. You could think about the P being the elite who are designing policies and V being everyone else. So, you know, it sort of matches a number of different settings. So passing a reform requires a collective approval. Here's how it works. The proposer first must propose a reform. The veto player must accept it. And the friction that we study is that the proposer observes features of the reform that the veto player does not. And what I'm going to show you with a very stylized example is when the veto player fears that the proposer is cherry picking reforms on the basis of reforms that are very favorable to the proposer, these are going to be not so favorable to the veto player, and hence she's going to reject the proposal. And this is going to lead to the conclusion that when the proposer has too much flexibility or an ability to design proposals, we're going to see more rejection of these proposals rather than acceptance. Okay. So here's the very stylized example I'll tell you about in the next 10 minutes. We have a status quo policy queue that leads both players to obtain a payoff of 0. There exists a series of potential reforms. Let's just enumerate them, 1 through K, that are going to generate payoffs. For the proposer, the payoff that they generate, I don't know if you can see my cursor as it moves around. Yes, okay, good. For the proposer, they generate this sort of delta plus some term that depends upon the reform. For the veto player, it's that same term delta minus some term that depends on the reform. And here's how we're interpreting this. Delta reflects the common gains that both parties have in passing a reform. They realize the status quo is not great. They would like to pass a reform if possible, but there's this conflict of interest where reforms that are better for the proposer are worse for the veto player, as reflected by RK. So so we see there's some common gains and there's some conflict of interest. And the friction, which is really going to tie us or connect us to the lemons problem, is that the proposer observes the gains from each reform and the veto player does not. So the veto player only knows the structure of the payoffs, but doesn't observe this. Just for the purposes of the talk, let's just imagine that these gains are somewhere between 1/2 to 1. I'm going to go with the number 2/3. And this payoff that for each reform RK is independently drawn and is uniform from 0 to 1. So that's the basic setup. I'm used to taking questions at this stage, but I'll continue diving in and put some darts on a dartboard. So let's put some darts on a dartboard here. So let's imagine that there were only one possible reform. It's the status quo. There's only one possible reform. The proposer really doesn't have any flexibility. There's no cherry picking here. So I've sort of drawn what could happen. So this is the top half of this page. So the value of that reform, R1, could be uniform from 0 to 1. Its expected value is 1/2. So now the veto player's payoff from the reform is the gains from passing a reform, which is 2/3, minus 1/2, which is strictly positive. So if the proposer only has one reform in his basket, then the veto player, then he would propose it and the veto player would accept it. Now the proposer has 2 reforms in his basket. Let's see what happens then. Once the proposer has 2 reforms in his basket and he sees the payoff that he obtains from each reform, he's going to pick his favorite reform, okay? And now there's a question where, and here I've got better and worse from the proposer's perspective. What is the value of RK, this conflict of interest, for the reform that's better for the proposer? Well, the expected value, given that these are uniform draws, I can sort of just work with the usual order statistics. The payoff of the expected one is 2/3, the expected payoff of the worst one is 1/3. Now, when the veto player says, should I approve this reform or not? She recognizes that the proposer is picking his favorite reform. And so she says, well, conditional, suppose this was reform 1, conditional on reform 1 being better than reform 2, the expected value of this term now is 2/3, which means the veto player is just indifferent between passing the reform and not. I think you can see where this is going. If I had 3 reforms, and so the proposer's now getting to cherry pick to a higher degree, he picks the favored reform, the value of this, the value of this term, conditional on this being the proposer's favorite reform, is now 3/4. And now the veto player says, you know what, I'm better off sticking with the status quo. Now that you've got the flexibility to pick from your favorite 3 proposals, probably the best one you're picking is worse off for you. So this is a very simple model in which we sort of see the sort of general conclusion outside of these parametric restrictions I've made, that in every equilibrium, the proposer is going to propose a reform that maximizes his advantage. And now there's going to be some bound on how big this basket is for the veto player to approve the reform. Once the basket is too big and has too many possible reforms in it, the veto player is going to reject because the proposer is going to be able to do too much cherry picking. So this is a simple stylized setting for how conflicts of interest plus private information could lead to this kind of political impasse. And both the proposer and the veto player may have Pareto gains from reducing the number of potential reforms. The problem is a commitment problem. Once the proposer has too many choices, he's going to cherry pick. And now the veto player is not willing to approve policies once there's too much cherry picking. Okay. In the paper, we investigate, the paper that doesn't exist yet, but is coming into existence soon, we investigate several potential solutions. One solution is some kind of bipartisan design, which is if the veto player were to obtain some private information with some chance, this can help, but it helps only to a moderate degree. And what we show is that in this case, the proposer is going to choose between her favorite reform and the best one that she knows if the veto player were to learn about, she would approve. So there's going to sort of be this trade-off that the proposer is going to think about. The second thing that's kind of interesting is that even though the veto player has no private information in this model, both the proposer and the veto player could be better off with the proposer saying, look, I'm not going to show you my favorite reform. Here are my favorite 3 reforms. Because once and you can choose randomly among these 3 reforms. Once the proposer is able to do this, then this is going to help her commit against cherry picking. And so that's another solution. Finally, you could ask, under what conditions could transfers help from the proposer to the veto player? We show that under certain conditions this could help, but this could also lead to issues where the veto player asks, if the proposer is willing to pay me this much to pass the reform, how much must the proposer must be gaining and how much must I be losing? So this corresponds to a quote that the Trojans were thought about, which is the beware of Greeks bearing gifts. Okay, so I don't know how I'm doing on time, but I'm out of slides. So essentially what we've been thinking about is the potential for adverse selection models, very simple, basic, static adverse selection models to help us better understand political frictions. And this resonates with the current political era where we often think about a lot of distrust and suspicion, and yet is something that's been underexplored in the bargaining or political economy literature. In fact, if you search for adverse selection in political economy in Google Scholar, you don't get that many hits. And this is sort of just using things that we already understand in economics outside of political economy. And we think that this could be very helpful and potentially be a more proximate cause for a lot of the distrust and suspicion that we see. Okay. That's all I have. I wanted to just show you my co-authors. A lot of this is joint work with Mihm and Lukas Siga at NYU-Abu Dhabi. That's not how NYU-Abu Dhabi looks, but that's them. And experiments are in collaboration with Chloe Tergiman. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Nageeb. So if there is any question, please do not hesitate to add them to the chat and then raise your hand. I had a question. So when you say that proposing multiple reform and let the voter or the veto person select, it's still a bit of the same problem, no? The proposer is going to select the best three options. So it's like a competition between the number of options and the number of, okay.
That's right, that's right. So there's still going to be some cherry picking, but now if the veto player says, here are my best five, the proposer says, here are my best five, it's limiting the degree of cherry picking to some degree. Yeah.
I guess is there another mechanism that comes to mind, which is another inefficiency that comes out of this would be instead you have the veto player have to pay a cost, which is, you know, a lot of cases where you have appointments, like a politician makes appointments, for instance, instead of reform appoint, then they have to be approved, right? So you go through a long approval process where you have an investigation, you have open hearings, you have, you know, basically the veto player does due process on each one of these suggestions to eliminate the asymmetric information, right? So another way in which this could manifest itself is, okay, look, we allow you to make all these decisions, but now each time you want to do this, we're going to have to go through a lengthy process of information gathering and vetting of all these things, right? And so then you burn resources doing that.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I agree with us. Yes.
Very good point. Yeah, you might be forced to follow the advice of the big person that you appointed, and very nice. And you of course, all the uncertainty is on the conflict of interest part.
That's right.
Because there might be also some uncertainty on how much of the common benefits might come, but it's, I don't know, all those climate reform that need to come and all the options that seems vast and what can benefit some industry versus other, it seems a very, very relevant.
That's right, that's right. So there's a sort of trade-off you could imagine more generally between the common gains and conflict of interest, which the expert or the proposer is better informed about than the veto player. We're in some ways isolating the adverse selection that comes from the conflict of interest.
Very interesting. I look forward to seeing the paper. So I'm going to share my screen now. Thank you so much, Nageeb.
Thank you.
Sorry. Okay. So thank you so much for being here. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a paper on political reservation as term limit. And this is joint work with Kate Brown, and who is at the University of Manchester, and Nishtha Kochhar, who is a student finishing at Georgetown University. So the context is India, where political reservation were introduced in India at the level of village council in '93, and mandated that a proportion, typically 1/3 of the seat, be reserved for women or for scheduled caste and scheduled tribe. The aim was to fight elite capture and the lack of political representation, and states where allowed to implement the policy how they wanted. In many states, conditional on some unobservable rules, the female reservations were randomly allocated, which was very good for evaluation. And so we have some famous papers. I don't know why my slide. Some famous paper looking at the effect of female reservation, finding some effect sometimes on public good allocation, mainly on water, and sometimes no effect. And some effect on representation, so higher aspirations for girls, less bias against female leader after seeing some female politicians. The SC/ST reservation, the low caste reservations, are typically conditional on share of population, so harder to evaluate, except in West Bengal where they have been randomized. And there's some evidence in West Bengal that they might be more targeting towards SC/ST individuals or hamlet by reserved seat for SC/ST politicians. But overall, when we look at India at large with other evaluation methods, there does not seem to be so much effect on allocation. Something that has been maybe underlooked is the fact that reservation also impose some term limits on incumbent presidents. So if you're a male incumbent and the seat is reserved for a woman in the next election, you're not eligible to contest for the same seat. So in practice, it imposed some term limits. Esther Duflo mentioned it in a paper in 2005, but where she looked in West Bengal, she did not see much of an effect, but we wanted to look again at the effect of term limit because there's a large literature in political economy that is showing some effect of term limit on politician behavior and often not for the best. Of course, there might be also some selection effect, but that depends on when the politician is informed on whether the seats are reserved or not in the next election term. So what we wanted to do is to investigate the impact of next period reservation as a term limit on incumbent politicians and looking at local public good provision and also private benefits. So we focus on panchayats, which are the village council and their president, which are called pradhan. So a panchayat is 10 to 15 village. And what the panchayat has as a principal responsibility is to identify the beneficiary of transfers for poverty alleviation schemes and construction and maintenance of some local public goods like street lights and irrigation and so on. There's very limited power to raise any revenue, so you think about more of a fixed budget that you allocate to those resources. So the pradhan is the greatest, the president is the one that has the most power. He's the only full-time panchayat member, often the only paid member, is the ultimate signatory on the official documents. And there's some paper saying that 40% of the council members say that it's the president that decides on the public good provision. And of course, there's also not a lack of evidence that document elite capture among officials also at the local level. And we might worry that being term limited, not having electoral consent might worsen the incentive to cater to the elite. So who are the elite in a village in India? So the traditional correlates of power that are still quite important is land ownership, which is a big proxy with wealth, and caste. And there's a number of papers, again, I'm not citing all the literature, but showing that the rich landowners are the elite in many villages. And of course, caste is also a very strong determinant, but the relationship between caste and eliteness has weakened a little bit with political affirmative action and some land reform, but it's still there. So the framework that we use is a very, very simple probabilistic voting model with some uniform shock, and we think about voters being partitioned in groups. They vote in the next election based on the utility they derive from QS, which would be an amount of public resources that is allocated to them. US might be an intensity of their preference. We think of the incumbent president as allocating a fixed budget in government intervention. And to cater to what we are interested in looking at, we are going to think about either local public goods, in which case those groups S are like street blocks in our villages. And we think about local public goods. So the cost of providing those goods is independent on the number of people that are in that group. And we are going to alternatively think about private benefits, like pro-poor benefits, in which case we think about us as group of beneficiaries, but then the cost is proportional. Those are transfers. So the cost is proportional to the size of the group. We think about the incumbent as motivated by two things: catering to the elite, pleasing the elite, but also caring about the potential re-election probability. And so simply the incumbent choose the allocation of the resource allocation, subject to a budget constraint, in order to maximize an objective that cares about the benefits of the elites, but also the probability of running, but weighting with the probability of winning and the benefits from winning again, but weighted by the probability of running again. And then it's easy to show that if we think about local public good, when we have street blocks with similar preference intensities, what's going to happen is when there's a higher probability of running again, street with a larger concentration of the elite are going to receive more of the allocation, while the street with a large share of the entire voting population, the mass, the most populated street, might receive less. When we are thinking about private benefits, then we think about group one as being the elite, and other groups might have the various preference regarding the goods. And what happens is when you're looking at raising the likelihood of probability, then the allocation to any non-elite group is going to increase in proportion with their need or their intensity of preference, while the share of the resources that is going to the elite is going to decrease. So we look at that in the REDS data. And we are going to look at the first two rounds, 95 and 2000, because for those rounds we can identify whether the politicians are term limited or not. We know whether there's a reservation coming in the next round of election, and we have a lot of information on the village and the households. So the main variable of interest are going to be the construction of local public goods that are targetable and somewhat exclusable at the street block level. And we are going to take drinking water, electricity, road, transportation, street lights, sanitation and irrigation, like Munchie and Rosenzweig. And we look at whether in that street block, there was some construction during the term. Okay, and we are also going to have the private transfers that are targetable at the household level that are meant for poor households. So those are like the BPL cards, some housing, water, and access to targetable public distribution systems. Okay. So what we are going to be interested in is the term limits effect, and we are going to be looking at whether there's more construction on street S at village B at election term, depending on whether the incumbent is term limited or not, and whether that depends on the proportion of households in the village on that street. or the proportion of land that is owned by the household that live on the street. So the land is not on the street block, but it's owned by the household that live on that street. And we are also going to look at private benefits for household I in village B at election term T. And similarly, we are going to look at the effect of term limited incumbent, depending on whether the household scarcity is, depending on the wealth of the household proxy by the land, and the reported income of the household. Okay, I don't know why. Okay, so what we are finding? What we are finding is when we look at those local public goods, ignore water for a moment, where the effects are actually reversed. What you see is that when you look at term limit, what you see is there's a tendency for less provision of public good when there's little lands, and a higher provision of the public good in a street block where a large share of the wealth is actually owned by those household members. So there's a lot of interaction terms. So to help with the comparison, you might think about looking at the marginal effect. And if you compare the streets that are in the 75th percentile of the land ownership, they're going to be 10 percentage points more likely to receive new electricity construction, new irrigation construction than streets that are at the 25th percentile in land ownership. And we're thinking about, and we are finding a 13 percentage point higher likelihood for the street to receive sanitation or street lights. For roads, we don't find a term limit effect, and for water it actually quite surprisingly goes the other way, but those are water pumps. So those are water pumps that the richer households do not care, because they tend to have some pipe water coming within their house when they can, but unfortunately we don't have that information. But we have some evidence regarding the preference for the goods, that those are goods that the richer household really do not care much about. We looked at whether land was a proxy for caste ownership or education or other definition of eliteness, and it's really the land ownership. It's also coming, if we do discrete variables for land ownership, it's coming from the big owners of the land. If we look at the household benefits, then again, we see a strong term limited effect. So there's more than 25% of the households that are landless. So if you look at the term limit effect, this is the term limit effect for the landless individuals. They are less likely to get the BBL card, which is the most important of those benefits for the household, the most prevalent. And you see that when you look at the interaction of term limit and land, you see that it's a positive effect. That is, when there's a term limited president, he tends to reallocate those benefits to households that are more wealthy in terms of land, except for water, where again we don't see such effect. And you see for the BPL card that he also tends to reallocate it to more wealthy households. And those are benefits that are meant for poor households. So I should pay attention to the time. Tough to be your own chair. Just to summarize, we find some evidence that term limited incumbents allocate more resources toward elite household as defined by land ownership. That effect is there for public and private resources, but not for water. And these findings have implication for how we think that those findings have implication for how we think about reservation, because when you look at the effect of the reservation themselves, there's a bit of underwhelming effect of, it's not that we find that the reserved politicians are providing more of those public goods or reallocating better. So we can look at in our own data what is the effect of reservation. We find no effect of women reservations that are randomized in the REDS data. Maybe a little bit of better targeting for BPL, one of the benefits, but worse for the TPDS. So it's really not obvious. When we looked at West Bengal, where the SCST reservation are randomized, what we find is that, yes, they provide a bit less water and electricity to landed street, but not more elsewhere. So they're providing a little bit less of those local public goods, water and electricity. They also provide fewer BPL cards. And we don't see evidence that they do favor more SCST streets or SCST households, which is consistent with a finding by Jensenius, a book that says that essentially those politicians have to cater to the same people. So it's really not clear that they tend to benefit more their own. And so we find an effect of elite capture of the term limits. And so, you know, all those effects are not very good for the reservation. But on the other hand, there are some papers finding nice effect of representation on aspirations for girls and for bias against women politicians that we should not ignore. But what we wanted to say is that there might be a cost to those reservations. And what is still unanswered is exactly what is driving these effects. Is it some form of quiproquo, or why this is happening? And I'm going to stop here and stop sharing and see if there's any question in the chat. And I don't see any question in the chat.
I have a question, Garance.
Yes.
Very nice, and a very nice analysis. I guess one question is that, you know, there's sort of two issues here going on at the same time. One is the reservations, and the other is the term limits. And it seems from your evidence that the term limits certainly distort the incentives. Is there a way to run the reservations without affecting, you know, somehow have parallel tracks so that there's re-elections governing both? And, you know, part of the problem seems to be that you're putting in these reservations in ways that then impose an artificial term limit, which then dilutes the incentives of re-election to govern the politicians. And
yeah, so it's a very good point. So first of all, as soon as you introduce those reservations, there's already a limited electoral horizon by definition. And one thing that I want to highlight is that what we are comparing is someone who is not reserved next term, but likely then to be reserved, you know, the time after, versus someone who is announced that is going to be reserved next. So everywhere we are comparing like the more term limited with the less term limited. I guess the type of policy then you go towards are the gender quotas, where you're not announcing for sure, but you're trying to cater. So many countries do not use reservation, where you're saying, okay, this time it's only women for sure, and you put a gender quota. But I guess that also either it works and it also limits the electoral or re-election. Once you're a man and you know that you're in power and you have some gender quota, maybe it limits your re-election. No, once for the incumbent, actually it helps you. Yes, this is Massimo's paper. But ex ante, if you're not there yet as a man, that might limit your chances.
Yeah, I mean, in Panchayat, you could imagine just having some say, okay, look, we have 12 seats, and we'll have 6 of them are women candidates run for these 6 and men for these 6, and that would be a way of having a reservation that then and then people could be reelected and have the election have no incumbency limits on those, so that people would have incentives to keep providing public goods to the general population to be reelected.
Yes, that's a good point, and that's related to, I'm also seeing Stefan Kloner's question on Pradhan, who is term limited, can of course run again after the reservation cycle, and this does happen, but of course you're each time talking about a number of years, so it does not mean that you can never run again, but putting reservations still lower your probability of being re-elected. But yes, it's not so easy to see how to design all those quota and all those compensation, and it serves the purpose of representation that is not to be totally ignored, but it has its cost, however you do it, no? And then sometimes with gender quota, then it's a farce, no? You put women on a list, but then they don't necessarily get elected, or unless you guarantee that they're elected, then, you know, it's not. Mexico has tried many different things. At first it was like they could be on a list, then they said that they needed to be the real candidates, and there's a lot of variation on how to try to do that, but and it remains the case that it's not so clear that you're going to. So once you care about the re-election, you care about the same population. So whether you're a woman or a man, or whether you're SC/ST or you're not SC/ST, you care about the same voter, irrespective of who you are. So it's not even so clear on how or why you would necessarily tend to favor your own, and the evidence is quite limited of that. So it's not even clear that it should help that way. And then when it's not for your electoral concern, then, you know, what this might suggest, we've actually find, looking at the reserve seats, the SC/ST president versus not SC/ST president, is that elite capture seems to be even stronger among the SC/ST presidents. So they might need to cater to the elite even more than a non-elite member. Sorry. Maybe
and I guess it's hard, it's hard when you have asymmetrically, when the president has more power than the rest. Like in just councils, it would be easier to adjust this kind of thing. But the problem is when you have single individuals that you have to have that position rotate, then it's much more complicated.
Yes, it is hard, but then, you know, some papers show that sometimes decision in group is not always better than decisions by one individual. So it's not clear how, depending on the model, it might even be worse if more individuals have to share the power of decision. I feel that I should stop myself. But thank you so much, Nageeb and Matt, and thank you for the audience. Thank you so much.
Thank you for organizing it. Thank you.